Margaret Chin sat in the sterile courthouse corridor, her hands folded carefully in her lap as she watched her husband of 23 years pace confidently near the water fountain. Richard Chun wore his most expensive Navy suit, the one she had helped him pick out 3 years ago for the Goldman Industries merger, though he would never remember that detail now. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, and his Rolex caught the fluorescent lights as he gestured animatedly to his attorney, Jonathan Prescott. She could hear fragments of their conversation from where she sat on the hard wooden bench. Richard's voice carried that familiar tone of absolute certainty, the same voice he used when explaining market strategies to potential investors or dismissing restaurant servers who brought the wrong wine. Today, that voice was directed at describing her. "Just a housewife," he said with a dismissive wave toward her direction. "23 years of managing our household while I built the empire. She never worked a day in her life, John. This should be straightforward." Margaret adjusted her simple black cardigan and smoothed her gray wool skirt. She had chosen her outfit carefully this morning, selecting pieces that would reinforce exactly the image Richard expected. Her wedding ring, a modest solitaire that seemed almost embarrassingly plain next to the diamond tennis bracelet adorning Richard's new girlfriend's wrist, caught a sliver of morning sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows. The girlfriend in question, Vanessa something, sat beside Richard on a nearby bench, scrolling through her phone with perfectly manicured nails. She couldn't be more than 28, with the kind of highlighted blonde hair that required monthly maintenance and a designer handbag that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Every few minutes, she would look up from her screen to shoot sympathetic glances toward Richard, as if she were watching him endure some terrible inconvenience rather than the dissolution of a marriage that had produced 2 children and built what Forbes magazine had recently valued at a $47 million business empire. Jonathan Prescott, Richard's attorney, nodded along to whatever elaborate strategy Richard was outlining. Prescott was the kind of lawyer who specialized in protecting wealthy men during messy divorces, and his reputation for aggressive tactics had earned him a corner office in downtown's most prestigious legal district. His gray pinstripe suit probably cost more than Margaret's car, and his confident smile suggested he viewed today's proceedings as little more than a formality. Margaret's own attorney, Sarah Kim, sat beside her reviewing documents from a worn leather briefcase. Sarah was younger than Prescott, perhaps in her early 40s, with practical black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and a conservative brown suit that spoke more to competence than intimidation. She had come highly recommended by Margaret's longtime friend Elena, who had insisted that Sarah's unassuming appearance masked a brilliant legal mind. The courthouse itself felt designed to intimidate, with its marble floors and towering columns that made everyone seem smaller than they actually were. Margaret had been here twice before for routine matters related to business filings, though Richard had never known about those visits. He assumed, like everyone else, that such legal complexities were far beyond her understanding. Richard's voice grew louder as he described his business achievements to Prescott. Chin Industries had started as a small consulting firm in their garage 24 years ago and had grown into a diversified corporate empire with holdings in real estate development, technology consulting, and import services. Richard loved to tell the story of those early days, how he had worked 18-hour days while Margaret stayed home with their infant daughter, how his vision and determination had transformed their modest suburban life into one of country club memberships and vacation homes. What he never mentioned in these retellings was how Margaret had spent those early evenings after putting their daughter to bed, sitting at the kitchen table with legal documents spread across the surface like pieces of a complex puzzle. She had taught herself corporate law through library books and online courses, learning the intricacies of business formation and regulatory compliance, while Richard focused on client acquisition and deal-making. She had never seen the need to correct his version of events. Success, she had learned, often benefited from appearing effortless. A court clerk emerged from the heavy oak doors leading to the courtroom and called their case number. Margaret rose smoothly, collecting her simple black purse and the single manila folder that contained what appeared to be her only documentation. Sarah Kim gathered her considerably more substantial briefcase, and together they walked toward the courtroom entrance. Richard and his entourage followed behind them. Margaret could hear Vanessa's heels clicking against the marble a staccato rhythm that seemed to announce her presence to everyone in the corridor. She was whispering something to Richard, probably words of encouragement or perhaps excitement about what she imagined would be a quick legal victory, followed by an expensive celebration dinner. As they entered the courtroom, Margaret noticed how Richard's posture straightened even further. This was his natural environment, she realized. Boardrooms, conference halls, courtrooms. Places where authority was performed and victories were claimed in front of witnesses. He had always thrived on such moments. Whether he was presenting quarterly reports to shareholders or explaining to neighbors why his latest business acquisition made perfect strategic sense. Judge Patricia Moorhead took her seat behind the bench, her gray hair pulled back severely and her black robes lending additional gravity to her already imposing presence. She had a reputation for efficiency and fairness, qualities that had served her well during 22 years on the family court bench. Her sharp eyes surveyed the assembled parties, lingering for a moment on Margaret's calm expression before moving to Richard's confident smile. The proceedings began with routine administrative matters, case numbers, and preliminary motions that established the basic framework of their dispute. Prescott rose to present Richard's position, his voice filling the courtroom with the kind of theatrical confidence that expensive legal training could provide. "Your Honor," he began, "this is a straightforward dissolution of marriage between parties with clearly defined roles and contributions. My client, Richard Chun, built Chun Industries from nothing into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, while Mrs. Chun maintained their household and raised their children. We seek a fair distribution of assets that reflects these respective contributions to the marriage." Margaret watched Richard nod approvingly at his attorney's opening statement. She could see him mentally rehearsing the testimony he would provide, the carefully constructed narrative of entrepreneurial success that painted him as the sole architect of their financial empire. He had told this story so many times over the years, at dinner parties and business conferences, that she suspected he had begun to believe it himself. Sarah Kim rose to respond, her voice quieter but carrying a kind of precision that made the courtroom seem to lean forward slightly. "Your Honor," she said, "we look forward to presenting evidence that will provide the court with a complete picture of how Chun Industries was actually built and who holds legal ownership of its various components. Mrs. Chun has been far more involved in the business operations than opposing counsel suggests, and the documentation will reflect her substantial contributions to what they characterize as my client's enterprise." Richard's eyebrows drew together slightly at this unexpected response. Margaret could see him turning toward Prescott with a questioning look, as if seeking reassurance that his attorney had anticipated this line of argument. Prescott's confident smile remained firmly in place, though Margaret noticed his fingers drumming once against his legal pad. From where she sat at the plaintiff's table, Margaret had a clear view of the gallery where Vanessa watched the proceedings with the fascination of someone attending an entertainment rather than participating in the dismantling of a family. Her phone remained in her lap, though she had at least had the courtesy to silence it for the court session. Margaret's own phone buzzed softly in her purse, a brief vibration that indicated an incoming message. She ignored it, knowing that Elena was probably checking on her progress and offering moral support. Elena had been her closest friend since college, one of the few people who had witnessed Margaret's transformation from an economics major with entrepreneurial dreams into what everyone else saw as a devoted wife and mother. Judge Moorhead addressed both attorneys, establishing the timeline for presenting evidence and calling witnesses. Margaret would testify, as would Richard, along with various expert witnesses who would analyze financial records and business valuations. The process was expected to take most of the day, though both sides had expressed confidence that the matter could be resolved efficiently. As the first witness was called to establish basic facts about the marriage and Richard's business activities, Margaret allowed herself to study her husband's profile. 23 years of marriage had taught her to read his expressions with considerable accuracy, and today she could see the particular kind of satisfaction he experienced when he believed he was about to achieve a significant victory. His jaw was relaxed, his shoulders square, and his eyes held the slight gleam that appeared whenever he successfully negotiated a favorable contract. She wondered if he would maintain that expression when Sarah Kim began presenting her evidence. "I always find it interesting when people come to watch these proceedings," she thought to herself as her gaze shifted to where Vanessa sat scrolling through what appeared to be social media posts. Some divorces generated genuine curiosity from friends and family, but this felt more like someone attending a sporting event where the outcome seemed predetermined. Margaret's phone buzzed again, and this time she glanced at the screen long enough to see that the message was from her business manager in Hong Kong, confirming that the quarterly reports had been filed successfully with the appropriate regulatory agencies. She slipped the phone back into her purse and returned her attention to the proceedings, aware that the first phase of today's carefully orchestrated revelation was about to begin. Jonathan Prescott rose from his seat with the kind of theatrical flourish that expensive legal training could provide, his silver cufflinks catching the courtroom lights as he adjusted his jacket. He had built his reputation on cases exactly like this one, where successful men sought to protect their assets from wives who had contributed what he termed domestic support rather than financial value. His opening statement would establish the narrative that had served him well in dozens of similar proceedings. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying across the courtroom with practiced authority, "my client Richard Chun represents the American dream in its purest form. 24 years ago, he started with nothing more than determination and a small desk in his garage. Through tireless work, innovative thinking, and strategic risk-taking, he transformed that modest beginning into Chun Industries, a corporation that now employs over 200 people and generates annual revenues exceeding $47 million. Richard nodded approvingly from his seat at the defendant's table, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who had heard this story told many times and never tired of its essential truth. Beside him, Vanessa listened with the rapt attention of someone discovering fascinating details about her boyfriend's impressive business acumen. She had heard portions of Richard's success story during their dinner dates, but the formal courtroom presentation lent additional gravitas to achievements she had previously understood only in general terms. Prescott continued his narrative, gesturing toward charts and financial documents that his paralegal had arranged on an easel near the judge's bench. These materials represented the fruits of Richard's entrepreneurial vision, he explained, detailing how Chun Industries had expanded from its original consulting services into real estate development, technology solutions, and international trade operations. The company's growth trajectory resembled a textbook case study in business expansion, with each new venture building logically upon the success of previous endeavors. During these crucial years of business development, Prescott noted, Mrs. Chun chose to focus her energies on creating a stable home environment for the family. She managed household operations while Mr. Chun worked the 18-hour days necessary to establish client relationships and secure the contracts that would become the foundation of his empire. Her contributions, while valuable to the family unit, were of a domestic rather than commercial nature. Margaret listened to this characterization with an expression of serene acceptance that seemed to confirm Prescott's narrative. She appeared every bit the traditional wife who had supported her husband's ambitions through home management and child-rearing, while remaining largely disconnected from the complex world of corporate strategy and financial planning. Her simple clothing and modest jewelry reinforced this impression, suggesting someone who had benefited from her husband's success without participating directly in its creation. Sarah Kim made occasional notes on her legal pad, but her reaction seemed measured rather than urgent. She did not object to Prescott's characterization of Margaret's role, nor did she appear particularly concerned by the portrait he was painting of a marriage between a business visionary and a devoted homemaker. Her calm demeanor suggested either remarkable confidence in her client's position or perhaps resignation to the strength of opposing counsel's argument. Prescott moved to his second major theme, the specific achievements that demonstrated Richard's singular role in building Chun Industries. He described the Goldman Industries merger, a complex transaction that had required months of negotiation and had ultimately doubled the company's market valuation. He detailed the expansion into Asian markets, highlighting Richard's personal relationships with distributors in Hong Kong and Taiwan that had opened lucrative new revenue streams. He emphasized the technology consulting division, noting how Richard's early recognition of emerging software trends had positioned Chun Industries as a leader in digital transformation services. Each of these accomplishments, Prescott argued, reflected Richard's unique combination of business insight, relationship-building skills, and strategic thinking. They were not the kind of achievements that could be attributed to general family support or household management, no matter how competently such domestic duties might have been performed. Richard's satisfaction with his attorney's presentation was evident in his relaxed posture and occasional approving nods. He had always taken pride in his ability to identify market opportunities that others missed, and hearing these successes described in formal legal terms reinforced his conviction that he had earned his wealth through individual merit rather than collaborative effort. Vanessa whispered something to Richard during a brief pause in Prescott's presentation, probably expressing admiration for the business achievements she was hearing described in detail for the first time. Richard smiled at whatever she said, clearly pleased to have his entrepreneurial success appreciated by someone who understood its significance. From the gallery, Margaret could see several people she recognized from Richard's business circles. Marcus Webb, his longtime partner in the real estate division, sat near the back with an expression of polite attention. Linda Torres, who managed the technology consulting arm of the business, checked her phone periodically but seemed to be following the proceedings with professional interest. Their presence suggested that Richard viewed today's court session as an opportunity to publicly reinforce his reputation as the driving force behind Chin Industries. Prescott transitioned to the financial evidence, presenting tax records and corporate filings that documented the growth of Richard's business empire over the past 2 decades. The numbers were impressive by any measure, showing steady increases in revenue and asset accumulation that reflected successful business management and market expansion. Bank statements revealed significant personal wealth that had accumulated alongside corporate growth, including investment accounts and real estate holdings that represented the tangible rewards of entrepreneurial success. Throughout this financial presentation, Margaret's name appeared infrequently in the documentation. Her signature was absent from major contracts. Her name did not appear on corporate board resolutions, and her involvement in business decisions seemed limited to standard spousal acknowledgments required for certain real estate transactions. The paper trail appeared to confirm Prescott's narrative of a marriage between a business builder and a domestic supporter. Judge Moorhead asked several clarifying questions about specific financial documents, seeking to understand the timeline of asset acquisition and the corporate structure of Chin Industries. Prescott answered each inquiry with confidence, clearly comfortable with the documentary evidence that supported his client's position. His responses reinforced the theme that Richard had been the architect and driving force behind every significant business decision that had generated the couple's wealth. During a brief recess, Richard stepped into the corridor with Vanessa and Prescott for a strategy consultation. Margaret could observe their conversation through the courtroom's glass doors, noting Richard's animated gestures and Vanessa's supportive expressions. They appeared to be discussing not just legal strategy, but also post-divorce plans, the kind of future arrangements that people make when they believe victory is assured. You know, if you are watching from somewhere that values hard work and individual achievement, you probably understand exactly why cases like this matter so much. Richard's story resonates because most of us have witnessed situations where someone builds something valuable through determination and skill, only to face questions about whether they deserve to keep what they have earned. I am curious about where you are watching from today and whether you have ever seen someone underestimated because of their quiet approach to handling important matters. Drop a comment and let me know your location and any experiences you have had with people who assumed they knew the whole story. When proceedings resumed, Prescott presented character witnesses who testified to Richard's business acumen and work ethic. These individuals described his reputation in professional circles, his ability to close complex deals, and his recognition as a leader in multiple industry sectors. Their testimony painted a picture of a man who had earned respect through demonstrated competence and consistent results over many years of business activity. Margaret's attorney did not cross-examine these witnesses aggressively, asking only basic questions about the timeline of their relationships with Richard and the specific nature of their business interactions. Her restrained approach seemed to acknowledge the strength of their testimony while avoiding confrontational tactics that might appear desperate or poorly planned. As the morning session drew to a close, Prescott delivered what he clearly intended as a compelling summary of his client's position. Richard Chun had built a business empire through individual effort, strategic thinking, and professional relationships that reflected his personal abilities and market insights. Margaret Chun had played a valuable but distinctly different role, managing domestic responsibilities that supported the family unit while remaining largely uninvolved in the commercial activities that had generated their wealth. The distribution of marital assets, Prescott argued, should reflect these different contributions to the marriage. Richard deserved to retain control and ownership of the business enterprise he had created, while Margaret should receive appropriate compensation for her domestic contributions and her role in maintaining the family environment that had enabled Richard's professional success. Richard appeared thoroughly satisfied with his attorney's presentation, shaking Prescott's hand warmly as they prepared to break for lunch. Vanessa gathered her designer purse and whispered what appeared to be congratulatory comments about how well the morning had proceeded. The confidence in their expressions suggested they viewed the afternoon session as little more than a formality before achieving the outcome they expected. Margaret remained seated at the plaintiff's table, reviewing documents with Sarah Kim while the courtroom gradually emptied. Her calm demeanor had remained constant throughout Prescott's presentation, showing neither distress at his characterization of her role nor anxiety about the strength of his arguments. If anything, she appeared to be waiting patiently for something, though what that might be remained unclear to the casual observer. Sarah Kim made a brief comment about reviewing certain business documents during the lunch break, mentioning something about corporate filings that might require clarification during the afternoon session. Her tone suggested routine preparation rather than urgent strategy revision, maintaining the measured approach she had displayed throughout the morning proceedings. As they prepared to leave the courtroom, Margaret's phone buzzed with another message. She glanced at the screen briefly before slipping it back into her purse, her expression unchanged. Whatever information she had received seemed neither surprising nor particularly urgent, just another routine communication in what appeared to be a very quiet life. The afternoon session would provide Richard's opportunity to testify in his own defense, to personally describe the achievements that Prescott had outlined in legal terms. He had been looking forward to this moment, the chance to tell his story directly to Judge Moorhead and to establish beyond doubt his role as the architect of Chun Industries' success. The afternoon session began with Sarah Kim approaching the judge's bench, carrying a thick manila folder that seemed to contain considerably more documentation than anyone had anticipated. Her previous restraint during Prescott's presentation now appeared to have been strategic patience rather than resignation to a weak position. Judge Moorhead regarded the folder with the expression of someone who had presided over enough family court cases to recognize when proceedings were about to take an unexpected direction. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice carrying a new authority that seemed to fill the courtroom more completely than it had during the morning session, "I would like to present evidence regarding the actual formation and legal structure of Chun Industries. While opposing counsel has provided a compelling narrative about my client's domestic role, the corporate documentation tells a different story about who was involved in building this business empire." Richard shifted in his seat, his confident posture faltering slightly as he watched Sarah remove a stack of documents from her folder. Beside him, Jonathan Prescott leaned forward with the expression of an attorney who was beginning to suspect that his morning presentation might have been based on incomplete information. Vanessa looked between Richard and his lawyer, clearly sensing a change in the room's energy without understanding its source. Sarah's first document was a copy of the original Articles of Incorporation for Chun Industries, filed with the California Secretary of State 24 years earlier. She approached the evidence table and placed the document where Judge Moorhead could examine it clearly, then returned to her position with the kind of measured confidence that suggested this was only the beginning of her presentation. "Your Honor," Sarah continued, "I direct the court's attention to the signature section of this founding document. While Mr. Chin's name appears as the listed president of the corporation, you will notice that the incorporating agent's signature belongs to Margaret Chun, and that she is listed as the corporation's chief financial officer and secretary." Richard's eyebrows drew together as he stared at the document Sarah had presented. This was not how he remembered the incorporation process. He recalled filling out paperwork in their kitchen while Margaret prepared dinner, occasionally asking her to sign documents that his attorney had marked with yellow sticky notes. He had assumed those signatures were routine spousal acknowledgments, the kind of formalities that married couples handled without much discussion or analysis. Prescott requested permission to examine the document, and Judge Moorhead granted his request. As he reviewed the incorporation papers, his confident expression gradually transformed into something closer to confusion. The signatures were clearly authentic. The dates corresponded to the timeline he had established during his morning presentation, but the legal structure they revealed was more complex than anything he had anticipated. Sarah continued with a second document, this one bearing the seal of the California Department of Corporations and dated 6 months after the original incorporation filing. This amendment to the corporate structure, she explained, established Margaret Chun as the holder of 60% of the company's voting shares, with Richard Chun controlling the remaining 40%. The document bore both of their signatures, along with that of a notary public who had witnessed the transaction. Richard leaned toward Prescott and whispered something urgent, his voice carrying the strained quality of someone trying to understand information that contradicted his fundamental assumptions about his own business. Prescott responded with equally hushed questions, clearly struggling to reconcile these new documents with the narrative he had spent the morning constructing. Judge Moorhead studied the shared distribution document carefully, noting the dates and signatures before asking Sarah to continue with her presentation. The courtroom had grown quieter, with even the casual observers seeming to sense that the proceedings were moving in an unexpected direction. Sarah's third document was a copy of the first major contract that Chun Industries had secured, a consulting agreement with Morrison Manufacturing that had represented Richard's breakthrough into corporate consulting services. The contract was signed by Morrison's procurement director and by Margaret Chun in her capacity as chief financial officer of Chun Industries. Richard's signature appeared nowhere on the document. This began a pattern that would continue throughout the company's early years, Sarah explained to the court. While Mr. Chun focused on client relationships and project delivery, Mrs. Chun handled the legal and financial aspects of running the business. She negotiated contract terms, managed corporate compliance requirements, and oversaw the financial planning that enabled the company's expansion into new markets and service areas. Richard's confusion was becoming visible to everyone in the courtroom. He kept looking back and forth between the documents Sarah was presenting and Prescott, as if seeking reassurance that there must be some explanation for what appeared to be his wife's extensive involvement in business operations he had believed were entirely his own responsibility. Vanessa had stopped checking her phone and was watching the proceedings with the fascination of someone witnessing a dramatic reversal in real time. The confident man she had been dating, the successful entrepreneur who had impressed her with stories of building a business empire through individual determination, was beginning to look like someone discovering uncomfortable truths about his own past. Sarah presented a fourth document, this one a loan application that Chun Industries had submitted to Wells Fargo during the company's second year of operation. The application listed Margaret Chun as the primary borrower, with Richard Chun as a cosigner. More significantly, the personal financial statement attached to the application showed that Margaret's individual assets substantially exceeded Richard's, including investment accounts and real estate holdings that predated their marriage. Your Honor, Sarah noted, this loan application reveals that Mrs. Chun not only provided the initial capital that enabled Chun Industries to expand beyond its startup phase, but that she possessed significant personal wealth that she chose to invest in supporting what Mr. Chun has characterized as his individual entrepreneurial venture. Judge Moorhead requested copies of the loan documentation for her own review, studying the financial statements with the careful attention that 22 years on the family court bench had taught her to apply to complex asset cases. The numbers were substantial enough to represent a significant personal investment in the company's success, far beyond what anyone might expect from someone whose role was limited to household management. Richard whispered something more urgent to Prescott, who was now reviewing documents with the expression of an attorney who was beginning to understand that his client's understanding of the business formation process had been incomplete. Prescott requested a brief consultation period, and Judge Moorhead granted a 15-minute recess for the defendant's table to review the new evidence. During the recess, Richard and Prescott huddled in intense conversation near the courtroom windows. Richard's gestures had become more animated, and his voice carried the strained quality of someone trying to explain circumstances he did not fully understand himself. Vanessa stood nearby, clearly excluded from the legal discussion, but watching Richard's increasingly agitated demeanor with growing concern. Margaret remained seated at the plaintiff's table, reviewing additional documents with Sarah Kim. Her calm expression had not changed throughout the presentation of evidence, suggesting either that she had anticipated these revelations or that she possessed information that would make the current documents seem routine by comparison. Sarah occasionally pointed to specific sections of various papers, but their conversation appeared to be more organizational than strategic. When proceedings resumed, Prescott attempted to address the corporate documents Sarah had presented. He argued that the signatures and legal filings represented routine administrative tasks that Richard had delegated to Margaret as a matter of convenience rather than business judgment. The incorporation papers and share distributions, he suggested, were technical formalities that did not reflect the actual decision-making and business development that had driven Chun Industries' success. Sarah responded by presenting a fifth document. This one a comprehensive business plan that Chun Industries had submitted to potential investors during its third year of operation. The plan was written entirely in Margaret's handwriting and bore her signature as the document's author. More significantly, the strategic analysis and market projections it contained demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of industry trends and competitive dynamics that went far beyond administrative support. The business plan outlined expansion strategies that Chun Industries had subsequently implemented, including the move into real estate development and the establishment of international trading relationships. It identified specific market opportunities and provided detailed financial projections that had proven remarkably accurate over the following years. Most importantly, it was clearly the work of someone with substantial business expertise rather than someone whose involvement was limited to clerical tasks. Richard stared at the business plan with an expression of complete bewilderment. He had no memory of Margaret writing such a document, though he clearly remembered presenting similar strategic analyses to investors and business partners over the years. The ideas and projections had seemed to emerge naturally from his own thinking about market opportunities, but seeing them laid out in Margaret's handwriting created a cognitive disconnect he was struggling to resolve. Prescott objected to the business plan's relevance, arguing that strategic documents written by one spouse did not necessarily indicate legal ownership or control of business operations. Judge Moorhead overruled the objection, noting that the document's authorship and content were relevant to understanding the actual roles each party had played in building Chun Industries. Sarah presented a sixth document, this one a power of attorney that Richard had signed during the company's fourth year, granting Margaret Chun complete authority to act on behalf of Chun Industries in all legal and financial matters. The power of attorney was comprehensive in scope, allowing Margaret to sign contracts, negotiate deals, establish banking relationships, and make investment decisions without requiring Richard's approval or even his knowledge. This power of attorney remained in effect for 12 years, Sarah noted, during which time Mrs. Chun used this authority to expand Chun Industries into multiple new markets and establish the international relationships that now generate over 60% of the company's annual revenue. Richard turned to stare at Margaret for the first time since the afternoon session had begun. His expression combined confusion with something approaching recognition, as if he was beginning to remember fragments of conversations and decisions that had seemed routine at the time, but now appeared to have been more significant than he had realized. Margaret met his gaze calmly, her expression neither defensive nor apologetic. For the first time since the proceedings had begun, she appeared ready to speak, though she waited for Sarah to complete her document presentation before addressing the court. "Your Honor," Margaret said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to command attention more effectively than Prescott's theatrical presentations had managed. "I think it might be helpful if I explained how Richard and I actually built Chun Industries together, and why the corporate structure reflects the roles we each played in creating what has become a successful business enterprise." Her voice was measured and confident, lacking any trace of the submissive deference that her appearance and demeanor had suggested throughout the morning session. This was clearly someone who was comfortable discussing complex business matters and who possessed detailed knowledge about corporate operations and strategic planning. Richard continued to stare at his wife, as if seeing someone he had never quite recognized before. The woman addressing Judge Moorhead bore little resemblance to the quiet homemaker he had described to Prescott, and whose domestic role had formed the foundation of their legal strategy. Judge Moorhead indicated that she was prepared to hear Margaret's testimony, and Sarah Kim stepped aside to allow her client to address the court directly. The afternoon session was about to reveal information that would fundamentally alter everyone's understanding of how Chun Industries had actually been built and who had been responsible for the strategic decisions that created its current success. Margaret stood before Judge Moorhead with the composure of someone who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. Her transformation from the quiet woman in the simple cardigan to this confident speaker addressing complex business matters was so complete that even the court reporter seemed to lean forward with increased attention. Sarah Kim stepped back slightly, allowing her client the space to control her own narrative for the first time in the proceedings. "Your Honor," Margaret began, her voice steady and professional, "I believe the court would benefit from hearing testimony from our forensic accountant, Dr. Elizabeth Warren, who has spent the past 6 months analyzing the actual ownership structure of what everyone refers to as Chun Industries. The corporate documents we have presented today represent only the surface layer of a much more complex business architecture that Richard and I developed over the past 2 decades. Richard's face had taken on an expression of complete bewilderment mixed with growing dread. He leaned heavily toward Prescott, whispering urgent questions that his attorney clearly could not answer. The confident businessman who had entered the courtroom that morning was rapidly being replaced by someone who appeared to be discovering that his fundamental assumptions about his own life had been incorrect. Judge Moorhead granted Margaret's request to call Dr. Warren as an expert witness. The forensic accountant was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a professional bun and wire-rimmed glasses that gave her an academic appearance. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades untangling complex financial structures for high-stakes legal proceedings. Dr. Warren approached the witness stand carrying a leather portfolio and a laptop computer, along with several large charts that Sarah Kim helped her arrange on the evidence easel. Her credentials were impressive: a Ph.D. in accounting from Stanford, 23 years as a partner at McKinsey & Company, and certification as a forensic financial analyst specializing in corporate ownership disputes. "Your Honor," Dr. Warren began, her voice carrying the clear precision of someone accustomed to explaining complex concepts to judges and juries, "I have conducted a comprehensive analysis of the business entities associated with Chun Industries, and I can report that the actual ownership structure is substantially different from what has been presented to the court this morning." She activated her laptop and projected the first of several organizational charts onto a screen that the court clerk had positioned where everyone could view it clearly. The chart showed Chun Industries as a single box at the center, surrounded by a complex web of interconnected entities with names like Pacific Holdings LLC, Golden Gate Investment Group, and Trans-Pacific Trade Solutions. "What Mr. Chun refers to as Chun Industries," Dr. Warren explained, "is actually a subsidiary of Pacific Holdings LLC, which was incorporated in Delaware 7 years ago. Pacific Holdings, in turn, is owned by Golden Gate Investment Group, a California limited liability company that was established 9 years ago. Golden Gate Investment Group is controlled by Margaret Chun through a trust structure that grants her complete operational authority over all subsidiary entities." Richard stared at the organizational chart as if he were looking at a map of a foreign country. The business empire he had believed he owned and controlled was revealed to be part of a sophisticated corporate structure that he had apparently never understood. His mouth opened slightly, but no words emerged as he tried to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his professional life. Prescott rose with an objection, arguing that complex corporate structures were common in successful businesses and did not necessarily indicate who had built or controlled the underlying operations. Judge Moorhead allowed Dr. Warren to continue her presentation, noting that the witness's expertise was directly relevant to understanding the actual ownership of marital assets. Dr. Warren moved to her second chart, this one showing the flow of money and decision-making authority throughout the corporate structure. Every major contract, Every expansion decision and every strategic partnership had been authorized through the LLC structure that Margaret controlled. Richard's role, according to the forensic analysis, had been that of a highly compensated employee rather than an owner or controlling partner. The real estate holdings that Mr. Chun considers his business achievements, Dr. Warren continued, are owned by Trans-Pacific Trade Solutions, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Golden Gate Investment Group. The technology consulting contracts are held by Digital Solutions LLC, another subsidiary entity. The international trading relationships are managed through Asia Pacific Commerce, which operates under the same ownership structure. She displayed a third chart showing the financial flows between these entities. Margaret's personal investment accounts had provided the initial capital for each expansion, and the profits from successful ventures had been systematically reinvested through the LLC structure to fund additional growth. Richard had received substantial compensation for his work, but the underlying assets and business relationships belonged to the corporate entities that Margaret controlled. Richard turned to stare at his wife with an expression of complete incredulity. The woman he had married 23 years ago, the quiet economics major who had seemed content to manage their household while he built his business empire, had apparently been constructing a sophisticated corporate architecture that made her the actual owner of everything he believed he had created. Vanessa had gone completely still in her seat, her phone forgotten in her lap as she watched the man she had been planning a future with discover that his entire professional identity had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The confidence and authority that had attracted her to Richard were evaporating in real time as he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of his ignorance about his own business affairs. Dr. Warren presented documentation showing that major business partners had been negotiating with Margaret's LLC entities from the very beginning of what everyone called Richard's business career. Goldman Industries had contracted with Pacific Holdings LLC for the merger that Richard considered his greatest professional achievement. The Asian distributors who generated substantial revenue for Chun Industries had formal agreements with Asia Pacific Commerce, an entity that Richard had apparently never known existed. Your Honor, Dr. Warren explained, Mr. Chun has functioned as an extremely capable business development executive and project manager, roles for which he has been well compensated. However, the legal ownership, strategic direction, and financial control of these business entities have always resided with the LLC structure that Mrs. Chun established and manages. Judge Moorhead asked several detailed questions about the timing of various corporate formations and the source of funds used to capitalize each entity. Dr. Warren's responses revealed that Margaret had been systematically building this business empire using a combination of her pre-marriage assets, strategic reinvestment of profits, and careful legal planning that had established her ownership rights from the very beginning. The most devastating revelation came when Dr. Warren displayed copies of employment agreements that Richard had signed with Pacific Holdings LLC. These contracts, updated every 2 years, clearly established Richard as a highly compensated employee with profit-sharing benefits rather than an owner of the business operations. His signature appeared on each agreement, along with salary and bonus structures that had provided him with substantial personal income. Richard stared at the employment contracts with the expression of someone discovering that his entire adult life had been built on a delusion. He had signed these documents in the home office that he and Margaret shared, usually during what he had believed were routine administrative sessions where she helped him organize paperwork for tax purposes and legal compliance. Prescott requested permission to cross-examine Dr. Warren, clearly hoping to challenge her analysis or find some interpretation of the corporate structure that would preserve his client's ownership claims. His questions focused on the possibility that the LLC arrangements were merely tax planning strategies rather than genuine ownership structures, or that Richard's role in business development had created some form of implied ownership rights. Dr. Warren responded to each question with the patient precision of someone who had anticipated every possible challenge to her analysis. The LLC structures were genuine ownership entities, not tax shelters. Richard's compensation, while substantial, had been clearly defined as employment income rather than ownership distributions. His business development activities, though valuable to the enterprises, had been performed under contract as an employee rather than as an owner making strategic decisions. During this cross-examination, Margaret remained seated calmly at the plaintiff's table, occasionally making notes, but showing no signs of anxiety about the scrutiny her business structure was receiving. If anything, she appeared to be waiting patiently for Dr. Warren to complete her explanation of arrangements that Margaret obviously understood in complete detail. Marcus Webb and Linda Torres, the business associates who had attended the morning session to support Richard, were now staring at the organizational charts with expressions of dawning recognition. They had indeed been negotiating with Margaret's LLC entities throughout their professional relationships, though they had assumed that the corporate structures were routine legal arrangements rather than indications of actual ownership and control. Linda Torres whispered something to Marcus Webb, and both of them looked toward Margaret with new understanding. The quiet woman they had occasionally encountered at company social events, the one they had assumed was Richard's supportive wife who helped with administrative tasks, had apparently been the actual decision-maker behind every major business development they had witnessed over the years. Dr. Warren concluded her testimony by presenting a comprehensive financial statement showing the current value of all assets controlled through Margaret's LLC structure. The total exceeded $63 million, substantially more than the $47 million valuation that Prescott had used during his morning presentation. The discrepancy reflected additional business entities and investment accounts that Richard had apparently never known existed. Judge Moorhead thanked Dr. Warren for her expert analysis and dismissed her from the witness stand. The courtroom had grown completely quiet except for the sound of Richard's labored breathing and the soft clicking of Vanessa's fingernails against her phone case as she nervously processed what she had just learned about her boyfriend's actual financial situation. Margaret rose from the plaintiff's table and approached the witness stand, prepared to provide her own testimony about how she had built and managed the business empire that everyone had attributed to Richard's entrepreneurial genius. Her transformation was now complete. The submissive housewife who had entered the courtroom that morning had been revealed as one of the most successful business executives anyone in the room had ever encountered. "Your Honor," Margaret said as she settled into the witness chair, "I think it would be helpful if I explained exactly how Richard and I built these companies together and why I structured the ownership arrangements in a way that would protect our family's financial security regardless of what might happen to our marriage." Richard continued to stare at his wife as if seeing a complete stranger. The woman taking the witness stand bore no resemblance to the person he thought he had been married to for 23 years. This Margaret Shin spoke with the authority of someone who had been making multi-million-dollar decisions while he believed he was the one building a business empire through his own individual effort and determination. Prescott looked desperately through his legal files, searching for some argument or precedent that might salvage his client's position in the face of evidence that had completely demolished the narrative he had spent the morning constructing. Richard's business empire had been revealed as an elaborate employment arrangement, and the quiet wife who was supposed to receive modest spousal support had been shown to be one of the most financially sophisticated people in the courtroom. The afternoon session was about to reveal exactly how Margaret had orchestrated this remarkable deception, and why she had allowed Richard to believe for more than 2 decades that he was building something that had actually belonged to her from the very beginning. Judge Moorhead reviewed the forensic accounting documentation one final time before addressing the courtroom with the measured authority that had defined her 22 years on the family court bench. The evidence presented during the afternoon session had fundamentally altered the nature of the proceedings, transforming what had appeared to be a routine asset division into a case study of corporate ownership and sophisticated business planning. "Your Honor," Margaret said from the witness stand, her voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment, "I want to be clear about something that seems to have caused confusion. Richard has always been an exceptional business development professional and client relationship manager. His skills in those areas are genuine, and his contributions to our company's success have been substantial. However, the legal ownership and strategic direction of these enterprises have always resided with the LLC structure that I established and have managed since our early years of marriage." Richard sat frozen at the defendant's table, his face displaying a mixture of shock and humiliation that was visible to everyone in the courtroom. The confident entrepreneur who had entered the building that morning had been systematically dismantled by revelations that exposed his complete ignorance about the actual structure of his professional life. Judge Moorhead studied the organizational charts that Dr. Warren had presented, cross-referencing them with the incorporation documents and employment agreements that had formed the foundation of Margaret's case. The documentation was comprehensive and internally consistent, creating a clear picture of business ownership that contradicted everything Richard's attorney had argued during his morning presentation. "Mrs. Chun," Judge Moorhead said, addressing Margaret directly, "can you explain to the court why you chose to structure these business arrangements in a way that concealed your ownership role from your husband?" Margaret adjusted her position slightly in the witness chair, her demeanor remaining composed as she prepared to address what was clearly the central question of the entire proceeding. Her transformation from submissive housewife to authoritative business executive was now complete, and her response would provide insight into motivations that had shaped more than 2 decades of carefully planned deception. "Your Honor," Margaret replied, "when Richard and I started our first company, I had significantly more business experience and financial resources than he did. I had worked as a corporate consultant before our marriage and had accumulated substantial personal assets through successful investments. Richard had tremendous enthusiasm and interpersonal skills, but he lacked the technical knowledge and capital necessary to build a sustainable enterprise." She paused, her gaze moving briefly toward Richard before returning to Judge Moorhead. Her expression showed neither malice nor regret, simply the practical assessment of someone explaining strategic decisions that had proven successful over many years. "I structured our business arrangements to protect our family's financial security while allowing Richard to develop his professional skills in areas where he demonstrated natural talent. The LLC ownership structure ensured that our enterprises would survive and prosper regardless of what might happen to our marriage or to Richard's individual performance as a business development executive." Richard made a strangled sound that might have been an attempt to speak, but Prescott placed a restraining hand on his arm. The attorney appeared to recognize that any intervention from his client at this point would only highlight the magnitude of his ignorance about his own business affairs. Vanessa had begun gathering her belongings with movements that suggested she was preparing to leave the courtroom regardless of whether the proceedings had concluded. The confident businessman she had been dating no longer existed, having been revealed as someone who had fundamentally misunderstood his own professional life for more than 2 decades. Judge Moorhead asked Margaret to continue with her explanation, clearly seeking to understand the timeline and methodology behind the business structure that had been revealed through the forensic accounting analysis. "Your Honor," Margaret continued, "over the years I expanded our original company into multiple business entities, each designed to serve specific markets and client relationships. Richard continued to excel at client development and project management, roles that provided him with substantial compensation and professional satisfaction. However, I maintained responsibility for strategic planning, legal compliance, financial management, and the expansion decisions that ultimately determined our enterprise's success or failure." She gestured toward the organizational charts that remained displayed on the evidence easel, her movement confident and authoritative in a way that would have been impossible to imagine based on her appearance during the morning session. "The international trading relationships that generate substantial revenue were developed through my pre-existing business contacts in Asia. The real estate investments were made using my personal capital and market analysis. The technology consulting division was built around proprietary software systems that I designed and that remain registered under my LLC entities." Marcus Webb and Linda Torres exchanged glances in the gallery, both of them clearly recognizing the truth of Margaret's statements. Their most successful business relationships had indeed involved negotiations with Margaret rather than Richard, though they had not understood the significance of those interactions at the time. Judge Moorhead reviewed the financial documentation one more time before rendering her decision. The evidence was overwhelming and unambiguous. Margaret Chun owned and controlled the business enterprises that her husband had believed were his personal achievements. "Based on the evidence presented today," Judge Moorhead announced, "the court finds that the business entities known collectively as Chun Industries are owned and controlled by LLC structures established and managed by Margaret Chun. The documentation clearly establishes Mrs. Chun's ownership rights, and Mr. Chen's role as a highly compensated employee of these enterprises. Richard's face crumpled as the judge's words registered. The business empire he had spent 23 years believing he had built through individual effort and determination belonged entirely to the wife he had dismissed as a simple housewife. Therefore, Judge Moorhead continued, the court awards Mrs. Chun complete ownership and control of all business entities, real estate holdings, and investment accounts associated with the LLC structures identified in the forensic accounting analysis. Mr. Chun will retain his personal assets and retirement accounts that are genuinely separate from the business enterprises. The judge's decision was swift and comprehensive. Margaret would retain ownership of the $63 million business empire because it had always been legally hers. Richard would leave the marriage with his personal savings, his car, and the sobering knowledge that his professional identity had been built on a complete misunderstanding of his actual role in creating their wealth. Margaret rose from the witness stand with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout the proceedings. Her victory was absolute, but her expression showed neither triumph nor vindictiveness. If anything, she appeared relieved that a deception she had maintained for more than 20 years had finally been resolved through legal proceedings. Richard remained seated at the defendant's table, staring at the organizational charts as if they contained some hidden message that might restore his understanding of his own life. Prescott gathered his legal materials with the mechanical movements of an attorney who had just experienced one of the most comprehensive defeats of his professional career. Vanessa had completed her preparations to leave and was moving toward the courtroom exit with quick steps that suggested she wanted to distance herself from the proceedings as rapidly as possible. The successful entrepreneur she had planned to build a future with no longer existed, having been replaced by someone whose professional accomplishments were revealed to be the product of elaborate employment arrangements managed by his wife. Margaret approached the plaintiff's table where Sarah Kim was organizing the legal documents that had secured their complete victory. The two women exchanged brief words of congratulation, but Margaret's focus had already shifted to the practical matters of managing business enterprises that she could now control openly rather than through the elaborate concealment that had defined the past 2 decades. Your Honor, Sarah Kim addressed Judge Moorhead, my client requests that the court's order include provisions for the immediate transfer of all business access codes, bank account authorities, and corporate control mechanisms to Mrs. Chun, given that Mr. Chun has been operating these entities without proper legal authority. Judge Moorhead granted the request, noting that the forensic accounting evidence had established Margaret's ownership rights beyond any reasonable dispute. Richard would lose access to the business accounts, office facilities, and corporate systems that he had believed were his personal domain as early as tomorrow morning. The systematic destruction of Richard's professional identity was now complete. Within 24 hours, he would discover that his business cards were invalid, his office access had been revoked, and his authority to make decisions on behalf of Chun Industries had been legally terminated. The empire he thought he had built would continue operating under Margaret's direct control, but his role in its success had been permanently eliminated. As the courtroom began to empty, Richard remained seated at the defendant's table, apparently unable to process the magnitude of his defeat. The confident businessman who had expected to protect his assets from his wife's divorce claims had instead discovered that those assets had never been his to protect. Margaret collected her simple black purse and walked toward the courtroom exit with the measured steps of someone who had important business matters to attend to. Her transformation was complete, and her long deception had ended with the kind of decisive victory that would ensure her financial security for the remainder of her life. 6 months after the divorce proceedings concluded, Margaret Chun stood in the executive conference room of what was now officially known as Pacific Holdings LLC, reviewing quarterly reports with the business partners who had once believed they were working with Richard's company. The room's floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown's financial district, and the mahogany conference table reflected the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the glass. Marcus Webb and Linda Torres sat across from Margaret, presenting their division's performance metrics with the professional deference they now understood she had always deserved. The transition to direct reporting relationships had been surprisingly smooth once everyone acknowledged the actual ownership structure that had been in place for more than 20 years. Margaret, Marcus began, his tone respectful in a way it had never been during the years when he had assumed she was simply Richard's supportive wife. The real estate division exceeded projections by 18% this quarter. The Singapore expansion you authorized last month is already generating substantial interest from potential clients. Margaret nodded approvingly as she reviewed the financial documentation that Marcus had prepared. Her transformation from the quiet woman in the courthouse corridor to the authoritative executive managing a $63 million business empire was now complete and publicly acknowledged by everyone who had previously underestimated her capabilities. Linda Torres provided updates on the technology consulting division, noting that several major clients had specifically requested to continue working with Pacific Holdings after learning about the change in visible leadership. The proprietary software systems that Margaret had developed remained highly competitive in their market segments, and the division's revenue growth showed no signs of slowing. The international trading relationships continued to flourish under Margaret's direct management, with her longtime contacts in Hong Kong and Taiwan expressing satisfaction that they could now negotiate openly with the person who had been making strategic decisions throughout their business relationships. Several new partnerships were under development, building on the foundation of trust that Margaret had carefully cultivated over many years. Margaret's office, formerly Richard's domain, had been redesigned to reflect her management style and business priorities. The walls displayed certificates recognizing her academic achievements and professional certifications, along with photographs from industry conferences where she was now welcomed as a respected executive rather than someone's accompanying spouse. Her daily routine had settled into the rhythm of someone who no longer needed to conceal her business activities or defer to someone else's schedule. Conference calls with international partners took place during normal business hours rather than being relegated to evenings when Richard was occupied with other matters. Strategic planning sessions were conducted in her office rather than at the kitchen table after family members had gone to bed. The business empire continued to expand under Margaret's open leadership. New ventures were being explored in renewable energy consulting and sustainable manufacturing, areas where her technical expertise and strategic vision could create additional revenue streams. The careful financial planning that had characterized her management style was now being applied to opportunities that would have been impossible to pursue when her ownership role remained hidden. Richard, meanwhile, had been forced to confront the reality of his actual professional qualifications once his employment with Pacific Holdings was terminated. The job search that followed had been a sobering experience for someone who had spent more than 20 years believing he was a successful entrepreneur rather than a skilled, but ultimately replaceable business development executive. After several months of unsuccessful interviews with executive search firms who could not understand why someone with his claimed business achievements was seeking employment rather than launching new ventures, Richard had accepted a position as a senior sales consultant with a mid-sized consulting firm. His compensation was less than half of what he had earned as an employee of Margaret's companies, and his new role involved reporting to managers who were significantly younger and less experienced than he was. The country club membership that had been maintained through Pacific Holdings was terminated when Richard could no longer afford the annual fees on his reduced salary. The luxury car lease was surrendered and replaced with a modest sedan that reflected his new financial circumstances. The vacation home that had hosted business entertaining was sold as part of the asset distribution, with the proceeds going to Margaret as the legal owner of the property. Vanessa had disappeared from Richard's life within weeks of the court proceedings, her interest in their relationship evaporating once his financial situation became clear. The successful entrepreneur she had been attracted to no longer existed, having been replaced by someone whose professional identity had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of his actual role in creating wealth. The social circle that had surrounded Richard during his years of apparent business success had similarly dissolved. Business associates who had once sought his opinion on market trends and strategic decisions now understood that the insights they had valued had actually originated with Margaret. The invitations to exclusive events and networking opportunities dried up once Richard's true employment status became known. Margaret's children, now adults with their own careers, had expressed pride in learning about their mother's business accomplishments. They had always known she was intelligent and capable, but the full scope of her professional achievements had been as much a revelation to them as it had been to everyone else. Both had offered to become more involved in the family enterprises, though Margaret preferred to maintain clear boundaries between her business activities and personal relationships. The legal proceedings had attracted attention from business publications that were fascinated by the story of a woman who had built and managed a multi-million-dollar enterprise while allowing her husband to receive credit for her achievements. Several articles have been published highlighting Margaret's strategic brilliance and the sophisticated corporate structure she had designed to protect her family's financial security. Industry conferences now invited Margaret to speak about business planning and corporate governance, recognizing expertise that had always existed but had previously remained hidden behind the assumption that Richard was the source of their company's success. Her presentations were well received by audiences who appreciated her practical insights and analytical approach to complex business challenges. The financial performance of Pacific Holdings and its subsidiary entities had improved measurably under Margaret's open management. Decision-making was more efficient without the need to maintain elaborate deceptions about who was actually controlling strategic directions. Business partners found it easier to negotiate with someone who could provide immediate authoritative responses rather than having to coordinate through intermediary arrangements. Margaret's personal life had also improved substantially. The stress of maintaining her elaborate concealment for more than 20 years had been replaced by the satisfaction of receiving appropriate recognition for her professional accomplishments. She could attend business events openly rather than being relegated to spouse activities while important decisions were discussed elsewhere. Her morning routine now included reviewing international market reports and participating in conference calls with business partners who understood her actual role in their enterprises. The kitchen table where she had once conducted business activities in secret had been returned to its intended function as a space for meals and family conversations. Stories like Margaret's make me think about how often we encounter people whose quiet confidence masks extraordinary capabilities. The tendency to judge others based on appearances or traditional role expectations can cause us to completely misunderstand who we are dealing with and what they are capable of achieving. I am genuinely curious about whether you have ever witnessed situations where someone's true abilities were revealed in ways that completely surprised everyone around them, or if you have personal experience with being underestimated because people made assumptions about your background or capabilities. Share your thoughts in the comments about times when justice was served to people who thought they knew the whole story but were completely wrong about who held the real power. The transformation of Margaret's professional life served as a powerful reminder that appearances could be deeply misleading and that the most significant achievements were often accomplished by people whose contributions were systematically overlooked or attributed to others. Her story demonstrated that patience, strategic planning, and careful preparation could ultimately triumph over arrogance and assumptions about who deserved credit for creating success. Richard's downfall, meanwhile, illustrated the dangers of believing one's own mythology without understanding the actual foundations of professional achievements. His confidence had been built on a fundamental ignorance about the source of his apparent success, and that ignorance had ultimately cost him everything he believed he had earned through individual effort and determination. The courtroom victory had been satisfying, but the lasting vindication came from Margaret's continued success as she expanded her business empire under her own name and received the recognition she had always deserved for her extraordinary business acumen and strategic vision.